Tonight, who do you want to be your next Prime Minister? Good evening and welcome to the Great Hall of the University of Birmingham for the third and final prime ministerial debate of this election. 3 men, each of whom wants to be our next Prime Minister. The leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, and the leader of the Labour Party, Gordon Brown. Tonight, a large part of the debate will be on the state of the country's economy, the recession, the national debt, unemployment, the issues that many people believe will decide this election. Our audience here is representative of this area. We've also selected some questioners from thousands of emails we received at the BBC News website. The leaders, of course, haven't been told the questions. And in any case, we start with brief opening remarks from each of them. First, David Cameron.
Good evening. Our economy is stuck in a rut, and we need change to get it moving. Let me tell you what I would do. First, we've got to reward work and tackle welfare dependency. Second, we've got to fix our banks, tax them to get our money back, regulate them properly, and get them lending again. Third, we've got to start making things again in this country. It's no policy to just borrow from the Chinese and buy goods made in China. Fourth, we've actually got to get value for money in our public services. I want good public services for everyone, and we can only do that if we save and stop the waste. Let me tell you one thing I wouldn't do. With Greece so much in the news, I can guarantee you that I would never join the euro, and I'd keep the pound as our currency. That's the change we need, and if you vote Conservative next Thursday, we can start to get to work on Friday.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Nick Clegg.
Tonight's debate is about you, about your job, the taxes you pay, your family, about the prosperity of our economy. We need to do things differently to build a new, stronger and fairer economy. The way they got us into this mess is not the way out. So we need to be frank about the cuts that will be needed so we can protect things like schools and hospitals. We'll need to break up our banking system so that irresponsible bankers can never again put your savings and your businesses at risk. We have to rediscover our passion for innovation, for building things, not just placing bets on the money markets. And we need fair taxes so that you don't pay any income tax on your first £10,000. Of course, they'll tell you tonight that these things can't be done. I think we've got to do things differently to deliver the fairness, the prosperity, and the jobs that you and your families deserve.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. Gordon Brown.
There's a lot to this job, and as you saw yesterday, I don't get all of it right. But I do know how to run the economy in good times and in bad. When the banks collapsed, I took immediate action to stop crisis becoming calamity and to stop a recession becoming a depression. And as a result of that, Britain is now on the road to recovery. But as we meet tonight, economies in Europe are in peril, and there is a risk of dragging us into recession. So I'm determined that nothing will happen in Britain that will put us back in that position. And I want to set out my plan and why this year is so important. Support the economy now, and you will ensure that there are jobs and a recovery, and ensure that we can have the resources for deficit reduction. Shrink the economy now, as the Conservatives would do, and they risk your jobs, your living standards and tax credits. So it's not my future that matters, it's your future that's on the ballot paper next Thursday. And I'm the one to fight for your future.
Mr. Brown, thank you. Well, now we take our first question of the night, and it comes from Nadim Afzal, please.
We all know there's going to be spending cuts after the general election, no matter who wins. Why can't you be honest and tell us?
Nick Clegg.
Well, we have set out in our manifesto, you can have a look at it in the back pages, we've set numbers, right there, specifying the savings that we do think should be made. We've set out in much greater detail than any other party, £15 billion worth of savings, which are a kind of upfront down payment to deal with this huge black hole we have in our public finances. What are we talking about? Things like scrapping the new generation of biometric passports, public sector pay restraint, saying that the top 20% of recipients of tax credits shouldn't receive those tax credits so they can be targeted elsewhere. I'm saying no to things like the multi-billion-pound Eurofighter Typhoon project, a defence project. Those are the kind of big decisions you need to take. What you can't do, and this is where I really disagree with David Cameron and Gordon Brown, is try and fool you into thinking that just efficiency savings are enough. You can't fill the black hole by just a few savings on pot plants and paper clips in Whitehall.
Gordon Brown.
We've set out a 4-year deficit reduction plan, and that starts from 2011. And it's designed to have tax rises that are fair, spending cuts that are equitable, and at the same time, growth in the economy that is essential for recovery. And our 4-year deficit reduction plans includes a rise in the top rate of tax above 100,000, taking away pension tax release for those above 100,000 at the higher rate, and a national insurance rise. But it also includes spending cuts in key areas. But we have one principle that we're adopting, and it's clear. We are not going to allow the frontline National Health Service or schools or policing to be cut. We will find the cuts in other areas as we've set out, including in public sector pay and pensions, and including the restructuring of government. But I do say one thing that is absolutely crucial. Don't believe that we can fail to support the economy this year. If we fail to support the economy this year, then we risk a double-dip recession, and that's really the problem with the Conservative policy.
David Cameron.
Well, Nadeem, you're quite right. There are going to have to be cuts, and we need to be frank about this. And we were the first to say that cuts would have to be made. But I really want to explain to people that if I'm your Prime Minister, I will do everything I can to protect the frontline services. I want to see the police officers on the beat, the money go into our children's state schools, the money on the ward in the hospital. That's absolutely essential. Now, we do have to say some of the difficult things we're going to do, and we have done that. We are not just relying on waste. We've said, for instance, there will have to be a public sector pay freeze for 1 year from 2011. That's not popular, but it is the right thing to do. We've said that people are going to have to retire a year later, starting in 2016. These are difficult decisions. But I believe also we've got to get our economy growing. We've got to get it moving. And that's why we say start now with efficiency savings to stop the jobs tax next year. Let's get employing people again in Britain. Let's get the economy moving to help us with the deficit.
Thank you very much. Well, those are the opening statements. Let me just repeat the question. We all know there are going to be spending cuts after the general election, no matter who wins. Why can't you be honest and tell us? And I assume it means tell us about all the cuts you might make. Nick Clegg, you have a chance to respond to what the others have said.
Well, I think one thing I would like to add is this, that Nadine, you're quite right in implying that none of the political parties have spelt out all the details. Some of them are simply not possible to spell out now, but clearly more work will need to be done. We've gone further than others, but clearly more will need to be done. But something which I think would make a huge difference to us all as we deal with these very difficult decisions about how to balance the books is for once to get the politicians actually working together on this. And I've suggested, and I don't know whether David Cameron and Gordon Brown want to take up my invitation, is that regardless of the outcome of the general election next week, wouldn't it be a good thing to get the Chancellor and the Vice-Chancellors of all the parties together with the Governor of the Bank of England, with the head of the Financial Services Authority, simply to sort of be open and be straight with you about how big this black hole is and roughly how long it's going to take to deal with it, so that we're all at least speaking from the same script about how big this problem is. I think politicians, for once putting the country before themselves, would be a very good thing on this issue.
Gordon Brown.
Let's be clear, from 2011, there will be cuts in spending in departments other than the NHS, other than schools, and other than policing. But we will make the commitment to maintain these frontline services and build on the improvements that we have made. Once you've built a school and a hospital, as we've done in the last few years, you don't need to build it again. So we can have cuts in capital investment. Public sector pay will not rise as it did in previous years, and public sector pensions are being reformed. But I have to say one thing that is absolutely crucial to the time we are in at the moment, in this uncertain and dangerous world. David is proposing that there be cuts in public spending now, $6 billion, and that will shrink the economy at a time when we need to support the economy. We cannot afford to lose jobs and businesses and lose growth now. We must maintain the recovery and support it. And please let us not make the mistake of the 1930s and the 1980s and the 1990s. And let us support the economy until the recovery is assured.
Your response, David Cameron?
Well, let me respond to this point about the £6 billion as directly as I possibly can. £6 billion saving this year, so we stop the jobs tax next year. That means saving one out of every £100 that the government spends. That is the glossy leaflet that comes through your door from the local council. That's one in £100. It's the fact that managers in the NHS got a 7% pay rise this year. That's the one in £100. We have the leaders of Britain's biggest and most successful businesses, Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, Mothercare, Chorus, the steelmakers, all saying that the risk to the recovery is not cutting waste. The risk to the recovery is putting up national insurance on every job in the country, which is what Labour proposed. So we say, roll up your sleeves now. Let's save the waste where we can to stop the taxes. It's the right thing to do, and it'll help get our economy moving.
Can we explore some of these ideas? Gordon Brown.
David's got it wrong. We're making 15 billion of efficiency savings now. He wants these savings on top of that without putting the money back into the economy. Look, you go to America, look at France, look at Germany, look at the other countries. They're saying, as all the international institutions are saying, don't withdraw the support from the recovery until the recovery is assured. What David would do in an emergency budget in a few weeks' time is, for ideological reasons, take £6 billion out of the economy and put our recovery at risk. The time to do the deficit reduction is when the recovery is assured. And David, you've just got it wrong economically, and it's the same mistake the Conservatives made, the same old Conservative Party of the 1930s, the 1980s and the 1990s.
David Cameron?
It is every business leader, every leading business leader is saying that we have got it right and the government going on wasting money is wrong. But let me tell you where I think we should start. We should start with welfare. Under this government, there are now 5 million people on out-of-work related benefits. There are people who could work, who we'd train and offer work. But we should say in our country, if you don't accept work, you can't go on claiming benefits. Now, that's something that Labour have left us with this terrible mess, and the Liberal Democrats have almost nothing to say about welfare. So as we try to get public spending under control, let's start with people who can work, who are offered work, but who don't take it.
Can I just try and move beyond this political point scoring? I mean, look, we are not as a nation going to be able to balance the books. We're not going to be able to fill the black hole in our public finances unless we also do it with fairness right at the heart of everything we do. People aren't going to accept these difficult decisions unless we also do it fairly. That's what I think, accompanying the difficult job of actually filling the structural deficit. We also need to introduce a big tax switch so that people on ordinary incomes, on low incomes, get a tax break, £700 back in their pockets, so they don't pay any income tax on the first £10,000 they've earned, by closing the loopholes at the top and using the money so that people feel that whilst difficult decisions are being made, at least the tax system is on their side. I think if you don't have fairness at the heart of everything we do, it's going to be very, very difficult to see us through these difficult decisions in the years to come.
Mr. Brown, you want to pick that up?
David and Nick are not addressing the question we face now. If you shrink the economy now, if you contract it, if you make the mistake of the 1930s, then you lose jobs, you lose growth, you lose businesses. We've got to support the recovery until it's fully established, and then my deficit reduction plan, which is a 4-year plan, comes into place. But take money out of the economy now, David, for ideological reasons, and you put the recovery at risk. And I do fear an emergency Tory budget in a few weeks' time, putting the very work that we've done to secure the recovery in jeopardy, and no other country in the world is prepared to do that now.
David Cameron, what do you say?
What Labour seem to confuse is they confuse the economy with the government. What we're saying is save
of £200,000. Now, that's not fairness. That's the same old Conservative Party. Tax cuts for the very rich and cutting the child tax credits of the very poor is simply not fair.
David Cameron.
Well, you're absolutely right. The taxpayer has been having to pay more and more and more as the government has spent more and more and has been so careless at trying to stop wasting money. We see waste all around us and the government's done so little about it. Now, obviously, with the terrible situation we have in our public finances, with the mess left by Gordon and Labour, where out of every £4 the government spends, one is borrowed, it's not possible to make great big tax giveaway promises. Even if it would be a lovely thing to do, you can't do it. But what we've said is let's try and stop the one tax that's going to hit the lowest paid people, and that's the national insurance tax I was referring to earlier. We can't stop all of the other taxes, the top rate of tax, the extra tax on the pension. I mean, Labour have put up tax something like 178 times, but we are going to stop that one tax that will hit the lowest paid the hardest. And let me just say this about tax credits. They will stay under a Conservative government, and Gordon Brown has got to stop misleading families in this country like he's been misleading older people and cancer patients as well.
You have a chance to answer that in a moment. Nick Clegg.
Is it Adina? Sorry, in this echoey hall, I couldn't hear you. Yes, Adina, I think you're absolutely right. Our tax system is grotesquely unfair. I mean, after 13 years of Labour, who would have believed it? That you would have now a tax system where a multi-millionaire from the City of London pays a lower rate of tax on their capital gains, that's income to you or me, than their cleaner does on their wages. After 13 years of Labour, we've got the bottom 20% of people in this country who pay more in tax as a proportion of their income than the top 20%. So I think we need to change that. David Cameron says you can't afford tax giveaways. No, you can't. What you can do is switch the tax system, make it fair, make sure that those huge loopholes that only people right at the top, very wealthy people who can afford a football team of lawyers and accountants to get out of paying tax, close those loopholes, give the money back to people so that they pay no income tax on the first £10,000 that you earn. That's £700 back in the pocket of the vast majority of you in this country.
Just before we go on, let me just repeat the question. Over the past few years, the taxman's taken more and more from the average worker's payslip. If you were elected, what would you do about taxes? And Gordon Brown, what would you say in reply to David Cameron's attack on you?
That nobody earning below £20,000 will pay the national insurance rise. The reason for the national insurance rise is to ensure our health services, our police and our education, and David cannot guarantee funding for police and education that will match what we're doing, but that's the reason for the national insurance rise, but nobody below 20,000 will pay it. 6 million people in this country receive tax credits, and the Conservatives and the Liberals have a plan to reduce tax credits for middle-class families. And I come back to this central question about fairness in the tax system. If David wants fairness in the tax system, why does he support this inheritance tax cut for only 3,000 families worth £200,000 each? The biggest beneficiary of the Conservative manifesto is, as always, the richest estates in the country and not the ordinary hard-working people of this country. And if the Liberals want to cut child tax credits with the Conservatives, then I can say one thing: I will never form an alliance with a Conservative government that cuts child tax credits.
David Cameron.
Well, what you're hearing is very desperate stuff from someone who's in a desperate state. But you have heard from Labour and Gordon Brown that if you earn £20,000 or over, you're considered rich. You're considered a target for the Labour government to go on wasting money this year and to hit you with taxes next year. Now, let me answer this question directly about inheritance tax. I believe in this country that if you work hard and you save money and you put aside money and you try and pay down your mortgage on a family home, you shouldn't have to sell that or give it to the taxman when you die. You should be able to pass it on to your children. It's the most natural human instinct of all. And I'm afraid these other two parties simply don't understand that. Inheritance tax should only be paid by the richest, by the millionaires. It shouldn't be paid by people who've worked hard and done the right thing in their lives. It's not our top priority. Our top priority is helping those on the £20,000 that are going to be hit by Gordon's other tax. But should we try and encourage people to work hard and save? I say, yes, we should.
Nick Clegg.
Well, I have to say, David Cameron's the most creative justification I've ever heard for giving tax breaks to double millionaires. But anyway, there you go. Look, I think Adina's point is that taxes are unfair on millions of people on ordinary incomes, not the double millionaires that David Cameron wants to help, on millions of ordinary people who are simply struggling to pay the fuel bills, to pay the petrol prices, to pay the weekly shopping bills. And what I'm totally with you on this, Adina. I think it's just wrong that, let's say you're, I don't know, a teaching assistant on £10,000 a year. At the moment, you will pay, let's say you work, I don't know, maybe 3 days a week, you will pay about £1,000 of that in tax and national insurance. Under our plan, by lifting the income tax threshold to £10,000, you won't pay any income tax on that first £10,000. I believe that if people work hard, particularly if they want to get off benefits and start working, even if it's just part-time, we should help them keep more of their money. It is as simple as that. That is the fair thing to do.
Tax means that we have tax credits, and 6 million people benefit from that. As far as the teaching assistant who's earning a very low income is concerned, there is the working tax credit that is available to them. But I come back to this central question about fairness that has been raised by our questioner. How can David possibly justify an inheritance tax cut for millionaires at a time when he wants to cut child tax credits? Let's be honest, the inheritance tax threshold for couples is £650,000. If your house is worth less than that, you pay no inheritance tax. What David is doing is giving 3,000 people, who are the richest people in the country, he's going to give them £200,000 each a year. Now that is simply unfair when he also wants, like Nick, to cut the child tax credits from ordinary families in this country. I've got to speak out about this because it's simply unfair and immoral for the Conservatives to put this as their election manifesto.
David Cameron.
Well, you're quite entitled to speak out, but the Prime Minister ought to get his facts right. And as so often, he gets his facts wrong. We all remember when he told us the defence budget went up every year, when in fact he didn't. It didn't go up every year when he was sending troops to war. On this issue of tax credits, we are saying we like tax credits. We will keep tax credits. But for families earning over £50,000, we think that we can't afford the child tax credit. That's one of the savings that we're being upfront and frank about. But for Gordon Brown to say that actually the changes we're making would hit low-income families is simply not true. And as I say, last week in these debates, he tried to frighten people, saying the Conservatives would take away benefits when we will keep the winter fuel allowance. We will keep the cold winter payment. He's trying again to frighten people, and actually he should be ashamed of what he's doing.
Nick Clegg, please.
Here they go again. Look, tax credits, which I think Gordon Brown's rightly raised, because tax credits are really, really important. I mean, I just don't think it makes sense really at a time when money is tight that someone even on my salary, which is a really good MP salary, could be entitled to the family component of tax credits. So I don't think it's right to have tax credits going so far up the income scale. Why do we say not for the top 20% of recipients? You can then target tax credits for people who need it. And the other thing I would say about tax credits is this. I've now had enough people in tears in my constituency office where I'm an MP in Sheffield because they've been given money one moment, they've spent that money on their children, on the heating bills, and then suddenly they get a letter out of the blue from the government saying, you've got to pay that money back. That is so unfair on particularly single parents and single mothers for whom the tax credits are an absolute lifeline. That's what I think tax credits should be given in 6 months.
Hold on, Mr. Brown,
can I just ask you to clarify something? You said a little bit
back
that both the Liberal Democrats
and the Conservatives wanted to abolish certain tax credits. And you couldn't support a Conservative party that wanted to do that. What about the Liberal Democrats?
The Liberal Party want to cut child tax credits as well. We're talking about tax credits paid to children. We have fought hard for a long time to make sure that we can give children
and families decent incomes. The Liberals will cut the child tax credits, and so will the Conservatives.
The Conservatives want to save 400 million, the Liberals 1.2 billion. The Institute of Fiscal Studies said that David's proposals and what he said were misleading, incomplete and regressive. And I come back to this question, why cut children's tax credits for middle-class families when you want to give a big inheritance tax cut to the richest estates in the country who do not need that money at the moment?
David Cameron.
People can remember the record of 13 years. They remember who it was who abolished
The 10p tax that hit some of the poorest people in the country the hardest. They remember the measly 75p increase on pensioners that Gordon Brown was responsible for.
for. And let me say this, the whole reason we're having this debate about how difficult it is to get taxes down, how difficult it's going to be to cut spending, is because this Prime Minister and this government
have left our economy in such a complete mess, with a budget deficit that this year is forecast to be bigger than that of Greece.
Right.
That's why we're having to have this debate. Let's not forget. Can I do some responsibility?
Clegg, very briefly, if you would, and we
I just
must
feel
move
an
on to the
automatic
next
sympathy for Adina, who must be completely lost by all this point scoring. The fact is, Adina, you are right. Taxes are unfair. We have a plan. We think it's a great plan to switch taxes so that you get more money back in your pocket. That's what I think we need to do to make taxes fair.
All right, let's go on to another question. Thank you, Mr. Clegg. And this one is from Ian Gray, please. Ian Gray.
It is clearly grossly unfair for taxpayers to have funded the banks, yet for bankers to award themselves huge bonuses whilst ordinary people are worse off and many have lost their jobs. How will each party bring its version of fairness to this very unfair situation?
David Cameron.
Well, Ian is absolutely right. It is completely unacceptable what has happened, and we need to grip it very, very hard to sort this out for the future. The first thing we need to do is actually regulate these banks properly. We would put back to the Bank of England the power to regulate the banks, including having a big say over the appalling bonuses that have been paid. The next thing we need is a bank levy, and we say don't wait for the rest of the world. Put that levy on now to start getting back the money from the banks that so many people have had to put in. We also want to see the banks lending again, particularly to small businesses, and so we need to make that happen. And something else we need to do is this. Retail banks, banks that you and I put our deposits into, they should not be behaving like casinos, taking wild bets. So we agree with President Obama's plan, which is actually to say those banks shouldn't be able to take part in the most risky activities. That, I think, would start to get this under control and make sure the banks serve the economy and serve the people rather than the people in the economy serving the banks.
Mr. Clegg.
Well, Ian, specifically on bonuses, I would say we need to do the following. Firstly, it sounds draconian, but I think it's now necessary. We should say no bonuses whatsoever to the directors of banks at board level. Why do I say that? Because I don't want people who are actually running those businesses, which they should be running for the long-term interests of the business and indeed for their clients, to be kind of susceptible to the temptations of the bonus incentive. By all means, pay them lots of money, give them a fancy membership of a golf club, but don't give them these bonuses. Then I would say absolutely no cash bonuses at all above £2,500. And finally, I don't think banks which are making losses should be handing out multi-billion-pound bonuses at all. Full stop. So no bonuses in banks who make a loss. No bonuses for people at director level, and no cash bonuses above £2,500. That's specific, it's tough, but it'll finally root out this outrageous abuse of bankers' bonuses.
Mr. Brown. David, I had to nationalise Northern Rock. And we had also to take over the Royal Bank of Scotland and Halifax Lloyds TSB. And the reason we did so was to save the savings and deposits of families throughout the country. If we hadn't done that, then the banks would have collapsed. But now we've got to restructure the banks in a way that is in the public interest. I have never been so angry as when I talked to the chairman of a bank who told me the night before his bank collapsed that all he had was a cash flow problem, when I knew it was a structural failing that was absolutely fundamental and the banks needed recapitalised immediately. Now, what we've got to do is recapitalise the banks so that they are safe for people. What we've then got to do is to make sure, as we're doing, that remuneration is fair. We do need a worldwide agreement to get a global financial levy that is charged in every country, so we're not undercut by other countries and there's a race to the bottom. But I would say to those bankers, we will never allow them to act in an irresponsible and unfair way again.
David Cameron.
Well, what I would say to what the Prime Minister has just said is that if you look at the Labour record over the last 13 years, they did very much hitch the whole fortunes of the economy to the City of London. And we got into a situation where we ended up with the whole economy having to serve the banks rather than the other way round. I assume the banker that we were just being told about was probably Fred Goodwin, so-called Fred the Shred. It was actually this government that gave this man a knighthood for services to bankers. banking. He not only broke his own bank, he very nearly brought down the whole economy. So there are big, big lessons to learn, and I think the most important is that we put the Bank of England back in charge of regulating the banks and give them the specific duty of calling time on debt in the economy. Things got completely out of control. The banks were regulated, but badly and by the wrong organisation. And the one party that wants to scrap the current system and put the Bank of England back in charge and change things is the Conservatives.
Mr. Clegg?
Well, David Cameron has been talking about parties being too close to the city. The blunt truth is that both Conservative and Labour governments now for ages have been far too close to the city, basically preferring the interests of the 1 square mile of the City of London rather than the 100,000 square miles of the whole of the United Kingdom. And what I think we now need to do is look fundamentally